Hello there. My name's Anthony Lopez, and today I'm here to present you my capstone that I worked on while I was with Savvy Coders. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself. So, my educational background is actually in history. I have an undergraduate in history, and I was actually partway through a graduate degree in history when COVID-19 hit. Now, I don't know if you know anything about the field of professional history, but it's a pretty small one before COVID hit. And then once COVID hit, it took that small field and made it even smaller. Um, Most of the endeavors of a public or professional historian are publicly funded. So those things don't tend to do too well in times of crisis. So I really had to take a look and look at what I was doing and then realize how can I adjust to make myself more competitive in today's job market. And that actually kind of related a little bit to my graduate research because when I was in graduate school, I was focusing on becoming a digital historian. My research was focused on the way we present oral histories in a digital form. I was working a lot with a content management system called Omeka. It's kind of like Squarespace for museums and um, archives, allowing them to organize their content and display that in a way that is meaningful for the museum and the people looking at the content itself. So I was already kind of steeped in the world of computing. Actually, my hobbies, a lot of them involved computing in some fashion or another. I'm really into Arduino projects. So Arduinos are small single board computers. People often use them to make robotics or projects like that. That's actually where the term maker comes from Maker Clerk, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So those Arduino projects, the Arduino language is actually based on C++. I actually wrote my 3D printers firmware using the Arduino language as well. I actually, on top of that, I have Unity experience, which is C sharp, and that pretty much covers outside of like modding games and just little things, kind of my experience of coding beforehand. And I guess that leads to the question why I chose Savvy. So I had already been kind of steeped in this world of coding, but I really needed somewhere to be accountable to kind of push me forward and help me coalesce all this knowledge I had gathered into something usable and something marketable for employment. So that's really why I chose Savvy, and it worked really well for that. Before going into the project itself, I want to talk a little bit about the organization and everything else using the project. So during this project for personal organization, I actually we all used a tool called Trello. Personally, I was not aware of something like this. This is a new process to me. I was kind of more of an on-the-fly thinker. But after using Trello, I can definitely see how it's very useful for developing software. Obviously, you can have an idea in your head of what things are going to do, but really breaking those down into digestible chunks is what makes you successful in developing. So I was able to do that for my project, and I'm happy to say I was able to get most of what I set out to do done in the short time we were at Savvy. Uh, Really, the big thing I had to drop was the original idea of Maker's Clerk, which really is just an information aggregator for online sellers. Right now, it's limited just to Amazon. But I wanted to include AliExpress functionality too, as far as making the list for people. And we'll go into a little bit for the need of the list here in a second. I wasn't able to do that. I had to pare down the project and focus on Amazon. It was a big enough beast on its own. And really, I just doing that allowed me to get all the functionality I wanted, like the exporting of lists and everything else. But that would make a whole lot more sense if I tell you exactly what Maker's Clerk is. But we'll get to that in a second. Um, Really, as far as a group goes, we made the decision to try to implement an agile environment while we were doing this cohort. It presented some challenges because at the end of the day, we are working on our individual projects. What we were able to do is kind of figure out a general trajectory based on our curriculum. So this allowed us to kind of organize what needs to be done in that week, what concepts we need to understand, and then the way our team chose to implement this was actually creating these cards, and then these cards included a checklist. Once these checklists are complete with everyone messaging them, you don't see the names anymore, but it would let each individual person in our group go in and check in the tasks they had done. Another big aspect of the agile environment was the daily stand up. So I really enjoyed that. because it gave me the opportunity not only to bounce ideas off of my classmates, but to be a technical resource for them. So we would go in and then we'd talk about what we're struggling with that day or anything else. And really, that allowed for a lot of problems to be solved in a quick manner. And I imagine that's pretty similar to what happens in a working environment. Usually someone else might have a better idea of how to approach a problem. And if you're talking about that in a short meeting, something that could have taken that person maybe 3 hours to research on their own now becomes a task that's a lot more manageable because they have that guidance. And that was really kind of invaluable. Um, Another thing that was really important were our sprint retrospective and sprint planning. So obviously we did the retrospective to kind of review, and because of the on-the-fly nature, it really was just a way for us to kind of hone in this process and make it work for Savvy and for this kind of individual project situation. Um, and then the retrospective, obvious, or after we'd have the retrospective, we would obviously have the planning. We would take that insight from what we think went well or what we think went wrong, and then we implement that into our next sprint. So moving on, let's talk about Maker's Clerk. So Maker's Clerk is actually kind of a pet project of mine to give back to the maker community. I mentioned earlier how I was into Arduino boards and those kind of projects, and that is the maker community. So these people will often make projects like small robotics projects. Pretty much anything you can imagine. They're really versatile hardware as far as it goes when it comes to these microcontrollers. So really, the sky's the limit. And what the community often does is they'll put their projects on display online for everyone to see, so they can recreate, their project and see their thought process and everything. And it's really kind of an open community that's more centered on like everyone learning together than it is about making money or anything like that. So I have enjoyed being in this community for a long time, and I really wanted to give back to it a little bit, and that's what kind of led me to this project. So what Maker's Clerk is it creates lists for you. So when these people write up their projects, that's inevitably going to include a parts list. These are the things you need from Amazon, etc. And that part list need uh, really it's a manual process. So they have to go in, find the parts they need, go gather the price, the name, maybe a picture of it if they even go that far. Um, what Maker's Clerk does is it automates this. And like I said, right now that's limited to Amazon. But what I'm doing is I'm having users submit links for items, and then it's going to go gather that information and return it back into a nice, neat, easy to understand HTML card that they can later export as an HTML file to have the list be usable without needing Maker's Clerk after that. So without further ado, I'm just going to give a little demonstration of the site and how it works. So I have here an Amazon link, and I'm going ahead and submit this link to my backend. And as you can see, we have a card here. What's interesting about these is that when you click on the item name, it's actually going to take you to that original Amazon item, making purchasing really easy. I'm going to go ahead and add a couple more items to the list so we can take a look at the download function. So we got our second item there, and then go ahead and go to this last one here. All right. And then I have a list preview. So this is really when you hit download list on the create list page, this is kind of a preview of what it's going to look like. There are a couple more things that I wanted to talk about really quickly about the site. One of them is this question button. As you can see, when you hover over it, the cursor changes. These are just general instructions on how to use the site, letting the user know that if they hit refresh, the data is not stored, so they really need to download their list before refreshing the page in any way. So I try to make that clear. I also have a PayPal donate button. When I first created this site, I never envisioned it to be something that would make money. I was really keeping that PayPal donate as it was really just a way to kind of keep the site going so to pay for server management, but I wasn't really looking to it for a profit, just so that it didn't cost me any money. Not to say that I haven't given any thought to how this could be profitable, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Uh, Really quick before I show you an exported list, I just want to show you that this site is mobile friendly. We do have mobile navigation. As you see in the list preview, I have a list over here that's generated. I'm going to go ahead and kick this out of mobile view and download a list. All right, so we have our download returned. We'll go ahead and save that and we'll take a look at it. So here's the downloaded list. Obviously, I have Maker's Clerk at the top. I have the green that I use for the site. One of the reasons why I made this a .html download is so that these links would still work. So as you can see, when I click on those links, it takes me directly to the item, and that was kind of really important to me. And it was important to me that people were able to use the site and not just have their list tied to the site of something they could take. So if they did a write-up, they can include this file with the write-up, and then you have a really simple way of kind of getting to the items you need to make the project. So that being said, that is kind of a cursory look at Maker's Clerk. I will go ahead and get into a little bit of the code and kind of the decisions I made and my thought process behind making this website. So the meat of what Maker's Clerk does actually happens in the back end. It is a RESTful API, and we'll go ahead and go to that. As you can see, it's a fairly complicated function. Um, and at the heart of this backend is a node package called Puppeteer. So what Puppeteer is actually it's a headless browser of Chrome. And really what's happening is when they're sending me links, I'm actually sending Puppeteer to that page and I am using DOM manipulation to gather the information that I'm putting on the card. So it's gathering the name, it's gathering a picture, and it's gathering a price. Um, that was actually a pretty complicated process. Amazon's a really big site. One of the biggest holdups I had while I was actually developing this had to do with getting the price for the items. So Amazon's pretty massive, meaning that there's not necessarily a uniform way for them to list the class selector of their price. So as I find these price selectors, these class selectors for the price element, I have to add them to this array. This was a conscious decision to be able to always be improving the functionality of Maker's Clerk without having to do a whole lot more coding. This array actually joins and uses regex to match it to the DOM element on the page and to be able to pull it. Um, it was something very complicated, and it was something I actually got help on in Stack Exchange, and I was lucky enough to have someone explain to me what was happening, and I was able to apply it to my price because the way Amazon, or I'm sorry, the product title, the way Amazon has that structured is they have a bunch of spaces around it, so I used regex to get rid of those spaces so I have nice, neat data to work with. Just a couple more things about the nature of Puppeteer. So obviously, because I'm using a scraper, when I'm getting these images, they are in PNG form. And we use the document store. So we use MongoDB for our backend. And it's not really good practice to throw binary data like a picture into a database. So what I end up having to do was actually use FS to convert that to base 64 and where I adjust the width and the height of the image as well, making them database friendly. Another way I used FS was actually at the beginning of the function, I'm actually creating the directory that these pictures are being stored in and then deleting it after I'm done converting them to base 64. What that allows me to do is to keep the server size manageable. If I wasn't controlling the file structure like that, the size would get out of control pretty quickly. Uh, so that's really kind of the main things I want to talk about on the back end. I'd be happy to answer questions about that later. Moving on, I just want to talk a little bit about some of my design decisions in general. So to structure the page, my main tool was CSS Grid. I do use some Flexbox, but CSS Grid turned out to be a lot more useful. And there were some conscious decisions with that. Uh, as you can see, I use the grid templates, most of which are actually being used on the page right now. What's not really being used are these body 1, 4, 3, and 6. And what those are actually reserved for that are for if I decide that I want to advertise or anything like that, uh, it'd be really easy to implement the ads in there. I just have to tell the API where to go. And I just kind of wanted to make that easy on myself if I did decide to go that way in the future, which at this point I'm thinking probably not, but it's always good to prepare. Um, So moving on about kind of design decisions and things, I just want to show you something on my how I'm constructing these cards. So this looks a little strange. When I get my response back from my back end, you just see a bunch of inline styles. And I know that's not the best practice, but there's actually a really good reason for that. Obviously, I have control over all the styles on my web page, but once I turn this into an HTML download, it's not exporting my style sheet with it. It's completely dependent on the text that I'm putting in that HTML file, which is why you see these styles. This is what makes it to where it still has a Maker Clerk logo. It still has the green background that my website has, and it also is able to flex and adjust properly with the window size, and that was just really important to me. Um, these are the cards that are actually displayed as you generate them, and in order to make the list, I actually um, add some more styles on top of the state driven array that I'm using to create the entire list to kind of wrap it up, give it the title, make sure it's the right size and everything else. So that was kind of interesting. Another thing that's happening is in order to download the file, I had to learn a little bit about blobs because when I returned from my backend, which is using Express and Mongoose for MongoDB, uh, when I returned those back, I had to be able to handle that. So with all that being said, I am happy to have presented this to you, and I hope that if you have any questions, you'll feel free to get a hold of me. And then thank you for your time.